The 27th of February, 1943. 8 men moved stealthily through snowbound woods deep in Nazi-occupied Norway. The tide of war is turning against Germany. One of its armies has just surrendered at Stalingrad. Soon, this small team will inflict another shattering blow, but one which will remain secret until the end of the war. Its target is the secret plant where heavy water, a crucial ingredient for Hitler's atomic bomb, is in full production. Evading the German guards, the attackers enter the complex. In the room where the heavy water is being produced, they lay explosive charges. The saboteurs then get away undetected, leaving a British Tommy gun as a calling card. The Nazis' hopes of producing an atomic bomb have been seriously disrupted. The men who carried out this daring mission were Norwegian agents of the British Special Operations Executive. Their raid and the follow-up to destroy all remaining stocks of heavy water was SOE's most vital achievement during the war. SOE deployed its agents throughout the countries occupied by German, Italian and Japanese forces. Their main task was to support local resistance movements and to do everything they could to hamper the Axis war effort. Although they worked in secret, the men and women of SOE and the resistance movements were among the bravest gladiators of World War II. By the end of June 1940, almost the whole of continental Europe, apart from the Balkans in the southeast, was under the sway of the Axis. Britain and her overseas empire stood alone. Yet even though Britain itself was now threatened by German invasion, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was determined to strike back. To do so, he formed the Commandos to raid the coastline of occupied Europe. But Churchill also believed that encouraging widespread revolt in the occupied countries would play a vital part in the defeat of Nazism. An organization was needed to build and coordinate this. In July 1940, the departments in military intelligence and the War Office, which looked after clandestine warfare, were combined to become the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. Churchill instructed it to set Europe ablaze, but this was not popular with its former masters.
They didn't like it. We had been told to set Europe ablaze, and of course what they wanted was complete peace and quiet in the areas where their agents were at work collecting information. The last thing they wanted in any given area was sabotage and something being blown up and tremendous reaction from the Gestapo.
SOE's headquarters was set up in an anonymous building in London's Baker Street, and its first battle was to survive the bureaucratic infighting in Whitehall. SOE was basically organized into operations and support departments. The former controlled agents through individual country or region desks, while the latter provided the necessary weapons and equipment. The support department developed its own catalogue. In addition to weapons and explosives, items such as exploding cigarettes, itching powder for German underwear, and even exploding rats could be supplied. The support department was also responsible for forging all the identity cards, passes, ration cards, and other documents without which no one could survive in occupied Europe. At first, agents were given clothing taken from refugees who reached Britain. But soon the support department had to develop its own camouflage section. This specialized in producing clothing to continental patterns. Every detail, such as the alignment of a collar stud hole, had to be correct. Nothing which might betray the origin of an agent could be overlooked.
Every article of clothing had to have all English marks removed, including zip fasteners on the flies, because they used to have lightning zip on nearly all of them. Well, all that had to be taken out with a dentist drill, because that would have been a giveaway straight away if an agent was captured. So it was a very, very thorough job, because a man's life depended on it.
The men and women whose lives would depend on it were SOE's principal asset, the agents who would be sent into the depths of enemy-held territory. The essential requirement for SOE's agents was obviously that they should be fluent in the language of the country in which they were to work and have a good knowledge of its ways. But beyond that, the selection procedure was surprisingly relaxed and informal, as Colonel Maurice Buckmaster, who ran F Section, which covered France, explains.
Obviously, you put them through a fairly detailed examination of their lives, what they'd done and why they'd done it, and their motivations, a judgment. Then you had to judge on your own. You had to say, I think this chap would do it, or I don't think this chap would do it.
To do it, the recruiters were looking for a special type of courage, as Vera Atkins, who worked for F Section, later described. Surviving agents often played down their role.
What was very brave and particular to them was to go behind enemy lines in civilian clothes without any backup and absolutely on their own. That is where the particular bravery comes in.
I never thought of myself as brave particularly. But looking back, I'm amazed the things I did or lived through.
I shouldn't have liked myself if I had not done it, I think. It was the only way to get our country liberated.
We were all very young, you see, all round about 20 to 30, and full of ideals. That's what kept us going. We had ideals.
After selection, agents were trained at a number of secret centres, usually requisitioned country houses. They were put through a strenuous course of fitness training and unarmed combat. They had to master a variety of weapons and had to become experts in handling explosives. Then agents were given their cover story and new identity, briefed on Axis security methods, and taught how to live and survive in a largely hostile environment. Even the most careful training did not always prepare them fully.
I went to Orléans with my reception committee. That's when I saw my first Germans. I turned round to look at them, and they told me never, ever do that. Never.
If the worst happened, agents were trained how to react.
If you were caught and being tortured, play for time was the motto, and therefore using your imagination about what you knew about your circuit and what they were likely to know about your movements, you would try and get 24 hours or longer before they really started bringing the lamp to bear.
With this chilling reminder of the dangers they faced, the agents were then committed to the field. Agents were trained to be parachuted into Nazi-occupied territories, or they could be landed at secret airstrips by aircraft flown by the RAF's Special Duties Squadrons. Once landed, the job of the agents was to establish and coordinate resistance networks. Francis Cammertz, a former school teacher who established a major network in southern France, described what was needed.
The network was going to operate against limited objectives, industrial sabotage, attacks on railways, telephone communication, things of this kind, and guerrilla warfare. That meant you had to find your local leader who was trusted by his people. He had to have a team of 15 to 20, perhaps a few more, a few less. He had to have his own parachute ground. He had to have his own means of hiding arms and equipment that were received and of distributing it on a local level. As far as possible, he was kept apart, certainly from an operational point of view, from other cells, so that the contact between the cells was very largely myself or one or two people in whom I particularly trusted.
The circuit organizer was usually supported by a radio operator and a courier. Women were often chosen as couriers since they were reckoned less likely to attract suspicion. A key element in SOE operations was the use of the BBC Overseas Service. This broadcast to every country under Axis occupation, enabling coded messages to be sent to the resistance.
Le chercheur d'or ira à la foire.
SOE was at its most active in Europe, where it experienced many successes, but also some tragic failures. Because of its distance from Britain, Eastern Europe was difficult to support. The Free Polish government was eager to do what it could to foster resistance to the Germans. SOE-trained agents were inserted to help the Polish Home Army, as the resistance was called, and some weapons were dropped. But when the Home Army rose against its German oppressors in Warsaw in August 1944, it was crushed after a bitter 6-week battle. SOE's Polish section did manage to organize some supply drops, but was largely frustrated by Moscow's unwillingness to allow these to be mounted from Soviet territory. In Czechoslovakia, SOE did score one significant success. In September 1941, the ruthless Reinhard Heydrich became governor of Bohemia, as the Germans called the rump of the country. His cruelty convinced the Czech government in exile that he must be assassinated, whatever the cost. The following spring, 2 SOE-trained agents were dropped into Czechoslovakia. On the morning of the 27th of May, 1942, they ambushed Heydrich while he was being driven to work. After their submachine gun had jammed, the agents managed to wound him with a grenade. The 2 men were eventually trapped in a church and, after a fierce gun battle, took their own lives, rather than allow themselves to be captured. In the meantime, Heydrich had died of his wounds. The Nazi retribution was horrific. More than 5,000 people were killed. The slaughter of innocent civilians in revenge for resistance activity was common throughout German-occupied countries. It was a terrible price which often had to be paid if SOE were to set Europe ablaze. In those parts of Europe closer to Britain, SOE could be more active. Small and relatively crowded, Denmark was difficult to penetrate, but from 1943 onwards, resistance became increasingly effective. SOE organized widespread industrial strikes and sabotage, forcing the Germans to keep 5 army divisions in the country to maintain order. These could have been of better use elsewhere. SOE intelligence also enabled RAF Mosquito bombers to make pinpoint raids in support of the Danish resistance. One of their notable successes was an attack on the Gestapo headquarters in the center of Copenhagen. Not only were its records destroyed, but several imprisoned Danish resistance members were able to escape. The most decisive blow struck by the SOE in Norway was also mounted from the air. The Norsk hydro plant in Telemark produced deuterium oxide, otherwise known as heavy water, which was vital for Nazi Germany's atomic bomb program. After an attempt to sabotage the plant had failed, a group of SOE agents parachuted into Norway. And on the night of the 27th of February 1943, they got into the plant unobserved by the German guards. They made their way to the condenser room and placed their charges. The fuses were lit, and the raiders made good their escape. Heavy water production was halted for 2 months. The SOE raiders withdrew into the wilds. Although pursued by German ski troops, they got clean away. 2 of the agents remained in Norway to monitor German activity. That November, after a US air attack on the plant, the Germans decided to cease heavy water production and take the remaining stocks to Germany. The first stage of the journey involved transporting the heavy water by rail to a nearby lake. The wagons were loaded on board a ferry to take them across the lake. But during the previous night, one of the SOE saboteurs who had remained behind managed to place charges aboard the ferry. Even though civilian casualties were likely when they exploded, the Norwegian government in exile had decided that the attack must go ahead. Once the ferry reached the center of the lake, the charges detonated. The railway wagons containing the heavy water sank to the bottom of the lake and put a virtual end to Hitler's hopes of building an atomic bomb. The Telemark attacks were arguably SOE's most important successes of the war. In stark contrast, its activities in Holland led to its greatest disaster. This began in the late summer of 1941, when an agent was arrested and a large number of SOE cipher messages seized. The Germans were able to begin breaking the SOE codes. Then a double agent helped the Germans to penetrate the network in The Hague. In March 1942, Herbert Lauers, the recently arrived radio operator, was arrested. His captor, German counterintelligence officer Major Hermann Giskus, forced him to transmit messages to SOE London. Even though Lauers deliberately left out his security code to show that he had been captured, and this was noted in London, the SOE's Dutch section inexplicably decided that this must just be an oversight. They continued to send out further agents and announce where these would be landed. The Gestapo were waiting for them. Giskus couldn't believe his luck. The Englandspiel, or England game as he called his operation, continued for 20 months. 61 agents were caught, most of whom were shot. It was not until November 1943 that London finally realized what was happening. And this was only after 2 of the arrested agents, Ben Ubink and Peter Duerlein, managed to escape and get to neutral Switzerland. Once there, they went to the British Embassy and revealed the whole disastrous story. Although SOE did send further agents to Holland, its relations with the Dutch resistance had been badly damaged. No convincing explanation for this tragic lapse in security has ever been put forward. Of all the occupied countries of Western Europe, France was always the most important, for it was here that the Allies planned to begin the liberation of Europe. Ever stronger German defences meant that this would be an enormously risky task, one in which the French resistance could play a vital role. After her defeat in 1940, France was split into two. The north and west were occupied by the Germans and placed under their military rule. The remainder of the country had a degree of autonomy under the Vichy regime of Marshal Philippe Pétain. It was somewhat easier for SOE to operate here. Even so, double agents and the hated Vichy police force, the milice, were a very real threat. The latter had no compunction in arresting fellow countrymen suspected of resistance activity. All over France, industry was devoted to the Nazi war effort, and this gave SOE one of its greatest opportunities. Attacks on industrial targets by RAF Bomber Command were proving disastrously inaccurate and causing widespread civilian casualties. SOE suggested a coordinated campaign of sabotage against specific targets. A typical case was the great Le Creusot weapons factory in eastern France near the Swiss border. In the summer of 1943, two agents, Raymond Basset and André Jarreau, who had been recruited locally, were parachuted back. Jarreau later explained their aim.
I wanted to attack factories, but not to destroy the factory or its workers. I wanted to destroy the factory's means of production, electric transformers, turbines, motors. They would repair them, and I would destroy them again. I was pleased to do my duty.
SOE had been able to identify the main electrical lines and transformers which powered what had been called the Krupps of France. These would be the pinpoint targets. On the night of the 31st of August 1943, Basset and Jarreau moved into action. The transformers, several in remote areas, were unguarded. Magnet bombs with time fuses were put in position. Ten transformers were wrecked, and Le Creusot put out of action for weeks. A similar operation was suggested by Harry Ray after he watched the Peugeot vehicle factory being bombed unsuccessfully.
So I then went to Peugeot's, got in touch with Rodolphe Peugeot, and said, look, wouldn't it be much more sensible if we did the sabotage on the ground and arranged for the RAF not to come again? He said, fine, yes. He said, I'll put you in touch with somebody who will put you in touch with somebody who will get you into the factory to see about the possibility of sabotage. And after that, I never went in again. There was a small team that organised itself of perhaps half a dozen people, and I provided them with the explosives, mainly the magnet bombs that you could just put onto a machine, and then with a time fuse, arrange for it to go off half an hour, 2 hours later.
Similar action could be taken to disrupt the transport system. But it didn't always have to involve explosives.
Pegleg used to change the weigh-bills on these wagons, and so a chap who was hoping to get his sulfuric acid, say, to Lorient for submarine batteries, it might turn up in Amiens at fighter aerodrome where they were expecting variable pitch propellers or something, you see, or carburettor parts or God knows what. And the buggeration of that and the frustration is monumental, and how to trace it is very, very difficult. Oh, Pigleg never got caught.
The growing number of SOE networks all over France provided valuable intelligence about the position of German units and kept watch on the building of German coastal defences, Hitler's much vaunted Atlantic Wall. For ultimately, all resistance activity was directed towards preparing for the liberation of France and Europe. Typical of the SOE agents operating in France was Odette Sanson, a French girl married to an Englishman. Although she had 3 young daughters, Odette had been appalled by the defeat of her country and volunteered for SOE. She was taken by boat from Gibraltar to the French Riviera, which was then under Vichy control, and landed there at the end of October 1942. Odette met up with Peter Churchill, the SOE leader in the area, and became his courier. Their primary task was to help organize an underground army of 20,000 men, which the local resistance claimed they could raise. But this became much riskier when, a few weeks later, the Germans took over all Vichy areas following the Allied landings in French North Africa. Hugo Bleicher, a German counterintelligence officer, was able to infiltrate the local resistance network. He took advantage of loose talk to locate and arrest Churchill and Odette in spring 1943. The 2 SOE agents were taken to Paris, where Odette survived months of excruciating torture at the hands of the Gestapo, without revealing anything of importance. After the war, she spoke of her experiences.
In those places, the only thing one could try to keep was a certain dignity. There was nothing else. And one could just have a little dignity and try to prove that one had a little spirit, and I suppose that kept one going. And when everything was really too difficult, too bad, then one was inspired by so many things, people. Perhaps a phrase that one would remember, that one had heard a long time before, or even a piece of poetry or a piece of music.
Odette was then sent, under sentence of death, to Ravensbrück concentration camp north of Berlin, together with other female SOE agents. Amazingly, Odette survived further horrors and was eventually liberated. But 1/3 of the women agents sent to France were tortured and killed after capture, but none ever betrayed anything vital. During the second half of 1943, with preparations for the invasion of Normandy underway, SOE support for the French resistance became even more important. Networks and plans were prepared so that once invasion came, German road and rail communications running into Normandy from the rest of France would be severely disrupted. The Maquis, a secret army of young Frenchmen, many of whom had taken to the hills of rural France to avoid being sent to work in Germany, was being armed and trained to operate in the German rear and pin down reinforcements. The number of SOE flights to drop weapons and other supplies to the networks increased steadily. But as more and more people became involved in gathering and hiding the supplies, so the opportunities for the Germans to penetrate the resistance grew. By early 1944, many of the key resistance figures in northern France were imprisoned in a jail at Amiens. Unless they could escape, the resistance in the region would be fatally crippled. SOE passed the details of the jail wing in which prisoners were housed to the RAF. On the morning of the 18th of February 1944, mosquitoes made a daring low-level attack on the prison. Its walls were breached, enabling 250 prisoners to escape. The resistance networks were functional again by D-Day. During the evening of the 5th of June, as the Allied invasion force approached the Normandy coast, the resistance networks established by SOE were called to arms. Long-awaited messages were heard on the BBC.
I was in the hay of a loft, and I really didn't even bother to go down the ladder, but jumped down so as to tell everybody about it, because this was the culminating moment, really, of our mission. They went round, got all their material out of the hiding places, cleaned the weapons, stuck the ammunition, and then they were ready to move the next day because the message came so quickly.
A carefully planned campaign of sabotage on the routes leading into Normandy from the south began. This film, secretly taken by the resistance, shows a German troop train derailed at Champigny, near Paris, and blocking a munitions train in a siding. One example of a resistance operation to slow down German reinforcements was that against the Das Reich Waffen-SS division. This started with tracking down the wagons on which its panzers should have been transported from southern France.
These wagons were very, very important because they were putting 3 or 4 in one little station on a siding, 3 or 4 in another. They were dispersed everywhere. They hardly stayed more than a day or 2 days in Montauban marshalling unit.
To deal with this, Tony Brooks' network came up with a novel and effective method of attack.
Old Michel converted some grease guns, flattened, made a fishtail at the end, and we mixed salvaged grease with carborundum powder in the garage, had masses of it, and then this was handed out to various people, young people, including one of his daughters, to go round and vaccinate these wagons.
The vaccinations proved totally effective. The bearings on the wagons soon seized up, and the Das Reich was obliged to set off for Normandy by road. Other parts of the resistance now went into action.
The Maquis and the Corrèze and the Creuse delayed it. Then they had the massacre of Oradour-sur-Glane, and then they got delayed north of Limoges, and then they got delayed when they got to the Loire. They planned to get to Normandy, to Caen, in 4 days. They took 16.
SOE also coordinated similar operations to coincide with the successful Allied landings in the south of France in August 1944. During the rapid drive north of American and French forces, the resistance acted as guides and provided information about the position of German formations. SOE was also deeply involved elsewhere in the Mediterranean. In 1941, it set up a separate headquarters in Cairo to cover the Middle East and the Balkans. This took over some of the Special Forces tasks of Headquarters Middle East. The main project that SOE inherited was to help in the liberation of Italian-held Abyssinia. Playing a major role was Colonel Ord Wingate, who later founded the Chindits. Accompanied by exiled Abyssinian Emperor Haile Selassie, he led a force of Abyssinians and Sudanese in a highly successful thrust into Abyssinia from Sudan. The crowning moment came on the 5th of May 1941, when Wingate and his men escorted the emperor into his capital, Addis Ababa. SOE could take some credit for this success, but its reputation in Cairo did not benefit. From the start, its headquarters was notoriously inefficient and lacked security. Every Egyptian cab driver appeared to know where it was. SOE's main problem was that it lacked good intelligence, largely because the British Secret Intelligence Service was unwilling to pass on any information. What intelligence SOE did gain was not trusted by London. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the Balkans. Following the German occupation of Yugoslavia, two distinct resistance groups formed. One, known as the Chetniks, was led by Royalist Colonel Draza Mihailovic. The other was under the iron grip of communist Josip Tito. Initially, the British government supported Mihailovic, but after a series of SOE-arranged missions, culminating with a visit by Churchill's special representative, Fitzroy Maclean, support was transferred to Tito and his partisans. As Churchill put it, they seemed to be killing more Germans. In Greece, too, resistance was fractured, with the communist-backed Elas movement being rivaled by the anti-monarchist but democratic EDES. SOE in Cairo had little knowledge of this, as became clear during the mounting of one of its most successful operations in Greece. In September 1942, SOE were asked to cut the railway line which ran down through Greece to the port of Piraeus to support the planned offensive by the 8th Army at El Alamein. This had been identified as one of the most important supply routes for Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps. SOE selected Eddie Myers, a regular engineer officer with little experience of clandestine operations, to lead the party. His second in command was Chris Woodhouse, a classical scholar who had already operated in Greece. The team was given hasty parachute training, and after one abortive attempt, its members parachuted into Greece in the early hours of the 1st of October. Their target was one of 3 railway bridges, Papadia, Asopos, and Gogopotamos, but they knew little about them. Myers and his men were beset by problems from the moment they landed. First, they were supposed to meet an EDES leader called Napoleon Zervas, but he was not there to receive them. They had been dropped in the wrong place. Then one of Myers' 3 4-man teams could not locate the dropping zone and returned to Egypt. Myers sent Woodhouse to find Zervas, giving him 14 days to do so, but this meant passing through territory controlled by Elas. Given the nature of the terrain, Woodhouse's mission seemed almost impossible. Woodhouse later described the confusions with which he was faced as a result of inadequate intelligence.
Zervas was nowhere near the area mentioned in my orders. And more serious still, I was told nothing by SOE or anybody else about the complex political relations and rivalries of the Greek guerrillas, nor even their names, which later were to become so familiar to us.
Nevertheless, he found Zervas and brought both his men and the rival local Elas group back to the base camp. The missing SOE team, which had successfully dropped 3 days later, was also located. In the meantime, Myers had carried out a reconnaissance. He decided that the team would attack the precipitous Gogopotamos Bridge. The SOE team and its Greek resistance supporters moved into position at the Gogopotamos Bridge on the evening of the 25th of November. Local villagers helped them transport the necessary explosives to their target, and supply trains chugged overhead as these were put in position. The Andates, as the Greek resistance fighters were called, engaged the Italian guard posts covering the bridge. Then came the signal that the bridge was about to be blown. The destruction of the Gogopotamos Bridge was an SOE triumph, not least in getting the rival resistance factions to cooperate. Unfortunately, By then, Rommel had already been driven back from El Alamein. Another blow was that the submarine that was supposed to take Myers and his men back to Egypt did not appear. They were therefore ordered to remain in Greece to provide training for the Andates. Despite this, in June 1943, the SOE agents did attack another of the railway bridges. This was Asopos, whose position on the side of a steep gorge made it a much more difficult target than the Gorgopotamos bridge. Luckily, scaffolding had been erected to enable repairs to be carried out, and this enabled the agents to place their charges. Once again, the SOE's target was destroyed. But after this second success, the Andates became increasingly involved in fighting among themselves. This eventually degenerated into civil war at the end of 1944, after Greece had been liberated. SOE was also active in the Far East from a base in Australia, after Japanese forces had overrun British, Dutch and American possessions in the area. The problems which it faced there were very different from those in Europe. The often inaccessible jungle which covered so much of the region made it difficult to maintain agents. While in the towns and cities, a Western agent stood out like a sore thumb. One very successful operation against Singapore Harbour was led by Captain Ivan Lyon. His group of saboteurs set sail from Australia on Operation Jaywick in a captured Japanese fishing boat in August 1943. After an epic 3-week voyage across 2,000 miles of Japanese-controlled seas, they were able to reach an island off Singapore undetected. There they set up camp and unloaded the kayaks which they had brought with them. On the evening of the 26th of September 1943, 3 kayaks slipped across the channel to the port. They attached limpet mines to the hulls of a number of merchant vessels and got away undetected. "50,000 tons of enemy shipping had been sunk. But a second attempt a year later was a disaster, with Lyon and all his party either killed or captured by the Japanese and later executed. In Malaya, SOE agent Freddie Spencer Chapman, who knew the country well, was able to set up a resistance network. This was made up of indigenous Chinese, who were keen to avenge the atrocities being perpetrated by the Japanese in China. Spencer Chapman and his men waged a lengthy campaign against Japanese communications in Malaya. Bridges were blown, convoys were ambushed, and large numbers of Japanese troops tied down far from the fighting fronts. In Burma, SOE and its American equivalent, the Office of Strategic Services, made much use of the hill tribes in the north of the country. During the latter stages of the Burma campaign, the tribesmen mounted numerous attacks and ambushes on the withdrawing Japanese, killing some 14,000 of them. During World War II, SOE operated throughout the world. Its efforts with the various resistance movements played a vital part in bringing about ultimate victory over the Axis powers. But many SOE agents lost their lives. Of more than 400 sent to France alone, 1/4 did not return. Others suffered severe torture. Their contribution was recognized by numerous awards for bravery. Among these was a George Cross, Britain's highest civilian decoration for gallantry, given to Odette Sansom for her exemplary conduct in captivity under extreme duress. The life of the SOE agent was a lonely one, lived amid constant danger. They required a different form of courage from that of the soldier on the battlefield. Nonetheless, they were true gladiators.